awesome lecture. We have the whole family in the back. Hello. Even homework. Anyway, I'm Linda Kuhn. I'm Dean of the Honors College, and I have to have an empty prop, so welcome to the mid-century modern Mike. Groucho Marx era. Pretty fabulous, huh? No, we're not going to be using it because it doesn't work, but it looks good, doesn't it? And it's in keeping with our Honors College Mike series, which is actually my favorite public lecture series because it features rock stars on campus, and of course it engages the Honors College and the wider community in this area, not just on campus, but off. And so we look for crazy people.
Thank you.
Outsider people, right? People with a big act and a big performance, cornerstone figures in the honors program at our college, and of course, Dr. Bob Cochran was the anchor of the Honors Humanities Project for many, many years, as were a number of people in this room. So he's very important to our endeavors. But as a scholar, he is an internationally renowned academic working in the field of folklore. And he has relentlessly pursued, what is that phrase of yours? He's refused to have a sort of decent specialization, i.e. to fit the academic mold, which is a straitjacket. You know, the older I get in this business, the more I realize that a lot of the best work are by people that just don't want to have any kind of boundaries, that are willing to work on the Irish playwright Samuel Beckett, and then turn around and put out a beautiful book on Arkansas film. From maple syrup producers to crafters of rugs, right, to poets, to blues artists. I'm saying that basically Bob Cochran's portfolio knows no boundaries. But it's super high-end, if you believe in that kind of thing as well. Guggenheim Fellow. 3 Fulbright Fellowships, Korea, Romania, and Hungary. Master of multiple books. And so you are going to be getting a wonderful piece of his fabulous work on outsider art, and you must be an outsider academic. So please join me in welcoming Bob Cochran, who will give a paper called Triumph and Rags, Adventures in Outsider Art.
Well, I knew Linda would be an impossible act to follow. So the first thing I have to say, given all that, is that I'm appearing before you as an imposter in one obvious way, that I received absolutely zero training in art, either in mainstream or outsider art, not so much as a single undergraduate class. And that's been my career. No one ever asked me to talk about Samuel Beckett, the one person that I really know something about. I've never been asked. The only time I've ever gone anywhere to talk about Samuel Beckett, I had to go to Scotland to do it under an assumed name, but that's a different story. And the first blame for this one falls on my spouse, Suzanne McCrae. When Linda, she told me this, when Linda said she was going to ask me to give this lecture, Suzanne said, why don't you ask him to talk about outsider art? He's really interested in that. So she did. And the truth is, even though I've made these claims of imposture, that I've really looked forward to this. And I've put probably more time into putting this talk together than any talk for the last 2 or 3 years. So, I'm very high tech for me today. I just turned the thing off. So is Michael still here? There we go. All right, so we're going to begin. This is a cover of a book published by the University of Arkansas Press. And there I am down in the right-hand corner in much bigger type than I deserved, given the modesty of my contribution. And the reason I picked it is that this was, as I understood it at the time, my introduction to writing about outsider art. Doris Curtis, I brought one of the paintings that she gave me, and I'll get to that later. But Doris Curtis, the book's featured artist, was a school teacher from Conway who coped with retirement's losses by taking up painting in a serious way. She didn't teach art. in school, so it was an avocational choice. Her deepest purposes were retrospective to the point of resurrection. Again and again, she painted scenes from an Oklahoma childhood recollected as idyllic, recreating as an old woman artist the lost world where she was young and cherished. I've put up 2 paintings of hers. Her great inspiration will be known to some of you was Grandma Moses. And she did painting after painting in this basic style. Here's one other one. So the rural eastern Oklahoma background. And here's what happened to her. It's an interesting story. In 2001, at the urging of friends in Conway, she submitted Come Walk With Me to the University of Arkansas Press. My opportunity arrived when the readers for the press found fault with her florid and loquacious prose, even as they raved over the paintings. So they wanted to accept the book, but they didn't like the prose. They loved the paintings. So I was asked, would I, for money, I'd never heard of Doris Curtis at this time, and as I told you, I'd never written about outsider art. Would I, for money, devote the summer of 2002 to editing her work, paring its most egregious excesses? I would, I did, and I ended up preparing the introduction, which in turn served as my entree, or so I thought at the time, to the world of outsider artists. The introduction itself was wholly a pleasure. There's nothing I like better than this. 3 months on the steepest slopes of the learning curve, paradise for me. I always love starting. It's like, because when you're starting and you don't know anything, your rate of learning is extraordinarily fast. And then as you start to know more about it, that rate slows down, right? So I love introduction to X, my whole life. The editing was another matter. Ms. Curtis did not agree with the press's readers. Her prose seemed just fine to her. And she took exception. It's the only time the word whippersnapper has been applied to me. I was 50 at the time, but she was 90. So she didn't like it at all. And in one moment of exasperation, she used that word. She said, here I was trucking whole paragraphs and pages to the recycle bin. But I was both ruthless and shameless, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. I cut relentlessly. She had 5 introductions, 1 to every chapter. I combined them into one. I removed many poems and several songs. There was even one recipe. She knew she was only going to have 1 book. I mean, she was 92 at the time, and this was her book. So she just shoveled everything in. And my job was to shovel out a lot of it, okay? I blamed every deletion, and Mike Beaker, the head of the UA Press, is here, so he'll understand this. I blamed every deletion that I made on then editor Larry Malley, who I described falsely as a city desk blue pencil zealot, trained on wire service syntax and hostile to every lyric ornament. So I would just always blame him, say that he insisted. My sympathies were with her, I assured Miss Curtis, but I served 2 masters, and publication would not go forward without Malley's approval. The apex of my disingenuous strategy came with the poems. I think there were about 32 poems in this book, which had absolutely nothing to do with the paintings. So they were terrible. These poems were terrible. If Ronnie Hawkins used to brag that he used to throw parties that Nero would be ashamed to attend, Doris Curtis wrote poems that Hallmark would have been ashamed to publish. I mean, they were really lame poems. So here's what I did. This is the apex of my shamelessness. I didn't tell her they were bad. I said, Ms. Curtis, these poems deserve a volume of their own. Okay. So we had a tough month or 2, but it all ended well, as I'll make clear later. Hell, she gave me this poem, this painting. She painted this at my request and gave it to me. So let's turn now to the world I encountered that summer. First among my outsider artist heroes was a man named James Hampton. And there's James. That is the title of James's only work. The throne of the third heaven of the nation's Millennium General Assembly. Some of you may have heard of James Hampton. His story is soon told. Born in South Carolina in 1909, in 1928 he followed an older brother north to Washington, D.C. to work as a short order cook. In 1942 he was drafted and served in carpentry and maintenance units in the Pacific. In 1946, back in Washington, he parlayed his honorable discharge with a Bronze Star medal into a janitorial job with the General Services Administration. 4 years later, in 1950, he rented a shabby garage space on N Street Northwest and began his real work. 14 years later, when he failed to pay his November rent, in fact, he died in the Veterans Hospital, his landlord visited the garage, opened the door, and was greeted by this work. This is a crucial slide for me. The slide on the left is what the landlord saw when he opened the garage door that he rented. He hadn't received the rent for December. Everything depends on this moment. That's why I put this slide, and I'll actually put it up twice so you'll see the context of the picture to the right. If the landlord at this point sees only clutter interfering with the prompt renewal of his revenue stream, Hampton's singular creation will be carted to the curb as junk. And the Smithsonian Museum today will be missing one of the nation's great works of visionary art. Fortunately, this didn't happen. Bewildered but impressed, the landlord, Meyer Wertlieb, praise his name, had the good sense or aesthetic response to summon a Washington Post reporter, who in turn wrote a story that launched Hampton's 180-piece masterpiece to the world. Driven by his visions and his Bible reading, and understanding himself as called to an incomparably larger custodial and priestly role, the janitor had constructed with junk retrieved from his day job a reception suite for the risen Messiah. A photograph found among his papers makes clear that on at least one occasion he arranged for a record of his role as he understood it. This was found in his papers, and there he is, dressed in a suit, with his throne. And the little thing behind, this is part of the real, there's only a little actual research I did for this paper, but I did look up the scriptural passage. And it's quite interesting. The hint is in the scriptural reference. Check out the 12th chapter of 2 Corinthians, as our chief executive labeled it, and you will find this passage. As always, the King James Version is the best. For in nothing am I behind the very chiefest apostles, though I be nothing. So he knew what he was up to. And that's what it is. It's pretty clear. Scholars have agreed that he had designed a reception room for the risen Lord in a garage in Washington, D.C., made out of junk. A half century has passed since that moment in the garage, and Hampton's throne has long since found its rightful place amid the nation's artistic treasures. Here it is as exhibited in the Smithsonian Museum. That's in the Smithsonian Museum of American Art. And I like this so much, and I never go to Washington and not go see it. The last time I went, and this was maybe 10 years ago, it was down. It was one of the great, I was crushed. And I wrote a number of emails sort of saying, what in the world is going on here? And I was reassured that it was just being cleaned and would soon be restored to its place. And I've checked on email, and it's back. You can see it again. I have one other picture of it as displayed at Colonial Williamsburg. That exhibit has traveled at least once, and there it is as displayed in Williamsburg. So that's my first outsider art hero, and I learned about Hampton while working on Doris Curtis's book. Okay. Now I'm going to go to my second figure. Meanwhile, even as Hampton pursues his priestly duties in his rented garage, a woman pulls the wheels off her trailer home in Simi Valley, California. So we're jumping clear across the continent. And if I push the right button here, we're going to spend a little bit of time with Tressa Prisbrey from Simi Valley, California. Her name is Tressa Prisbrey. She's had a tough, itinerant life, and she's ready to settle down. Born in Minnesota in 1896, the baby in a family of 8 children, she grew up in poverty, moved to North Dakota at 12, and was married at 15 to her older sister's 52-year-old ex-husband, or fiancé. I was sold, she said. One account says the husband financed a blacksmith shop for her father, and in her own telling, the new husband built onto the family home and bought new furniture. 20 years and 7 children later, husband either dead or left behind, she's on the West Coast, in Oregon and Washington first. This is during the Second World War, and she's working in factories to support her children. Romance for her is a losing game. 2 boyfriends, one a fiancé, die on her. In 1947, in California now, she marries Al Prisbrey. A decade later, in 1956, she takes the wheels off the trailer. At about this time, she builds her first bottle house, and you can see the sign there says Grandma Prisbrey's Bottle Village. Okay. She calls it the Pencil House, and she builds it because she needs space for her 17,000 artfully arranged pencil collection. Let's jump to that. So she builds a house out of it's called Bottle Village because she builds all the structures out of bottles that she gets from the dump. She tried to get cinder blocks, but they were too expensive. And she'd seen a small bottle house at Knott's Berry Farm, and that gave her the idea. So she went to the local dump and collected bottles, and before she was done, she built at least 13 of these structures on her property. They have names: the Roundhouse, the Rumpus Room, the Shell House, the Meditation Room, where when tourists started showing up, she gave tours, and she ended the tours in the Meditation Room with Prisbrey playing the piano and singing bawdy songs from the 1920s and 1930s. These buildings serve her needs. Grandchildren play in the Rumpus Room in good times, and dying children, 1 son and 1 daughter, are cared for in hard days. She had 2 children come to the Bottle Village to be cared for in their terminal illnesses. So let me give you a couple other slides. This is the first one I picked because it shows her artfully arranged pencil collection, which she had 17,000 pencils. She's obviously a compulsive hoarder. But people who grow up poor have their reasons. There's an exterior shot of one of the structures in Bottle Village. And here's one other shot of one exterior shot, okay? The most poignant structure of all, at least for me, I've toured all these places, right? So I've been, but anyway, there's one that just struck me, as it seems to have struck no one else, is a structure she calls Cleopatra's Bedroom. There's the outside of it. Prisbrey loved to gamble. She says so straight out in a wonderfully celebratory film documentary, and several black and white photos show her as a happy visitor to Las Vegas, dressed to kill, cigarette and drink in hand. The sidewalk she constructed to connect her buildings, as you can't really see it on this shot, features a set of decorative hearts, diamonds, clubs, and spades. Combine these elements: the child bride, saddled with 7 children in 14 years, who later cherishes visits to Vegas with boyfriends, sings bawdy songs to tourists, and builds with her own hands, out of throwaway bottles, a boudoir she calls Cleopatra's Bedroom. Isn't it clear that, like Hampton, she rejected in her mind the subordinated role the world handed her, and insisted, with her hands, on redesigning her own life as a cross between a party animal vamp and Mother Teresa? So that's one edge of the continent to the other. So I'm going to jump ahead quickly now to maybe a better known figure. It's hard to be better known than James Hampton in the world of outsider art now, but one who might be close to it is Henry Darger. Henry Darger was from the Midwest. I've deliberately given it a kind of geographical range here. We're going to end in Arkansas. Darger was a Midwesterner like Prisbrey, born in Chicago in 1892. But unlike Prisbrey, he never left, and he spent his whole adult life in Illinois. That life was hard from the beginning. Darger's mother died in childbirth when he was 4. He never met the sister who survived. She was put up for adoption. When he was 8, his invalid father, a tailor, was hospitalized, and Darger was sent to the Illinois Asylum for Feeble-Minded Children. He succeeded in running away in 1908 after several failed tries. Returning to Chicago, he found work as a janitor and dishwasher. And there he stayed, living in the same rooms on Webster Avenue in Lincoln Park for 43 years. Until no longer able to climb the stairs, he was moved to St. Augustine's Catholic Mission Home just months before his death. His father had died in the same building 73 years before. So it's a you know, for overall bleakness, this is a tough story to top. At least Hampton had his brother, and Prisbrey her children, and romantic trips to Vegas. Darger had nobody. There is one friend of record, though he soon left Chicago. But then comes the moment analogous to Hampton's landlord opening the rented garage. This is the other half of the slide we saw earlier. It's the right-hand slide. This is what greeted Darger's landlord when he opened the apartment after Darger's death. He was greeted not by a single glittering work of visionary art, but by a disordered mess. Balls of twine, Pepto-Bismol bottles, hundreds of newspaper and magazine clippings of little girls tacked and taped to the wall. The mother lode was a 15,000-page typed manuscript of an epic novel, accompanied by some 300 illustrations, mostly watercolors. The largest ones, 12-foot scrolls painted on both sides. Nathan Lerner, the landlord, like Vertlieb at the door of Hampton's garage, saw art and not junk. It is this trove, curated, exhibited, published, and sold for almost half a century now, that has made Darger as famous as any name in the world of outsider art. This is a little story. My daughter and my daughter Maisie and Suzanne once went shopping to try to get me a present for a birthday, and they started with Darger, but they didn't end with Darger, because they were told that you could pick up a very nice Darger for about $75,000. So that's gone up. Dargers have now, there's a Darger that's now sold for over $1 million. I'll show you, I think I have a picture in here. They ended up with a Harold Finster piece, which I cherish, but we'll get to that later. Here's the, let's give you a little bit of, so there's 2 pictures. This is what they found. It was in loose leaf notebooks, and you can see it says volume 3 of the Realms of the Unreal, which is part of the title. And on the left is one of his paintings. At the center of this epic novel are 7 sisters, the Vivian girls, who lead a rebellion of child slaves against their Glandolinian masters. A General Darger figures in the narrative as an ally of the girls. Where Hampton created a place for himself in the end-time narrative of the Baptist religion he was born to, the Darger who was neglected and abused as a child crafted a world inside his room where he could enact a heroic role as a protector and defender of children. So I've got a couple of paintings of Darger's here that illustrate scenes from his novel. There's one, and here's another one. Notice in this one, it took me just a minute to notice this one, because quite often, although in most of the stories, the Vivian girls, and there you see the 7 Vivian girls, the one here in the foreground appears to be throwing grenades, right? So there's a kind of active military participation by the Vivian girls. So we've seen Henry Darger, we've seen Tressa Prisbrey, and we've seen James Hampton. For all their individual differences of theme and artistic medium, they put forward deeply personal visions. Each one erects a stage for the enactment of her or his own desired country. Joe Minter is different. He's the latest of the figures that I wanted to stress here today. This is Joe Minter, from Birmingham, Alabama. And he, like Hampton, had one work. His work is a yard show. It's a title that scholars have applied to these kind of things where artists sort of use their yard to express themselves. His is called African Village in America. It's in Birmingham. Here the focus is social and political. Minter's African Village in America, a homemade civil rights museum built in his Birmingham yard, features pride in African American achievement and outrage at the persistent injustices visited upon black people in American life. Here's an example of his work. Just covered with writing. I think I've wandered through this place, and it's maybe an acre and a half. Okay, I'm just going to pick it back up. Minter's ties to Alabama and Birmingham run deep. He was born in the city in 1943 to Alabama-born parents. His father was for most of his working life the caretaker of a local graveyard, and Minter's home, this actual place, is bordered by 2 historically black cemeteries. There's maybe 100,000 ancestors right here, Minter says. He started work on his village in 1989 after a varied occupational life in auto body shops and on road crews and construction sites was ended by a worsening glaucoma. And I have several other things of his. I took a lot of pictures of this place. So this is his reconstruction of the Edmund Pettus Bridge. So it's basically a history of America in a series of tableaus. Okay, and you can see the heading, it says Edmund Pettus Bridge in there. And it's just, there's no borders and there's no prescribed tour route. Here's another one. This is much more recent. This is the, Eric Garner case, just much more recent. And here for the first time, Cochran appears. He was eager to, he's a very seasoned tour guide. And so he of course I welcomed this whenever it was offered, but I usually didn't say, can I have a picture with you when I was at these places? I usually waited to be invited. Well, I was very quickly invited by Joe Minter. He's a really outgoing, and friendly guy. And I greatly enjoyed standing there with him. This is, as I say, a much more recent visit for us. And now I have one more, I think, before we really turn to a different phase. And this last figure is again back in California. And he doesn't have a story as striking as some of the other ones. But Leonard Knight out in California is famous, again, for one work. He wrote a work called Salvation Mountain. And his story might be the weirdest one that we have. It's not quite as bleak. He's not Southern like Minter and Hampton, nor Midwestern like Prisbrey and Darger. He's a New Englander. He was born in Vermont in 1931, but he ended up, like Prisbrey, in Southern California, in the Imperial Valley Desert, not far from the Mexican border. His Salvation Mountain emerged quite by accident from the failure of a very different project, very different long-term project. Following a sudden road to Damascus Christian conversion during a California visit to his sister, and she'd been working on his salvation for years, Knight was back home in Vermont, where he worked as a laborer, when he saw a hot air balloon go over his head, festooned with beer advertisements. And it hit him that this would be a great evangelical vehicle. So he decided that he would build a hot air balloon and put Christian messages on it and fly from Vermont to California to visit his sister. He knew nothing of balloons, but he set out at once to construct one. And this is maybe the most heartwarming story. The guy's obviously nuts, right? He doesn't know a thing about building hot air balloons. But driving back and forth across the country, sort of saying, he's trying to find out how he can build this thing, he ends up at one point in Nebraska where a guy named Copy Jones, his name is C-O-P-Y, Copy Jones and his wife say that they'll help him. And they know something about balloons. And Jones's wife loans Leonard her sewing machine. So he actually goes to work and creates an enormous balloon. Alone and with the help of others, Knight pursues his dream of balloon evangelism for a decade. But it wasn't to be. The balloon was too large. Even at maximum inflation, it would not fly. Finally, after a last attempt, when he was working changing big rig tires in Quartzsite, Arizona, Knight threw in the towel when the now rotted fabric gave way. Liking the desert Southwest, he decided to stay and began what became his signature structure in 1984 with a cement replica of the failed balloon. So he moves seamlessly from being a balloon evangelist to, a mountain builder. And the mountain, and he decorates everything. The picture down here in the corner, that's typical. When I visited there were like 8 of these vehicles, including the trailer that he lived in, were decorated with these sort of exhortations. I do something wrong every time. There's the balloon. See, the balloon's immense. It's way too big. But it's got all this, it's got, Jesus loves you and the sinner's prayer and those things on it. So here, what he does is he goes from the balloon, look how it dwarfs that truck. Look how big that balloon is. That's a, what do you call it? That's a dirigible. It's not a balloon. It's a Zeppelin. Okay. All right, so here's the mountain. It's huge. Mountain is enormous. Okay. This is Salvation Mountain. It's still there. And characteristically, I should tell you, remember I showed you that garage and the apartment. Characteristically, what happens when one of these outsider artists dies is that a second figure or a group of figures is required, because one of two things is going to happen. It's like with the apartment and the garage. It's going to get carted to the curb as junk, or somebody's going to save it. And that's true of these larger structures too. And I could give you examples of glorious, the whole range, from glorious restoration projects, multi-million-dollar restoration projects, to places where it just rots into the ground. Okay. So let me show you. I think there's another couple ones of these. I think I make a second appearance here, but not in this one. So this, you can see, this hundreds of thousands of gallons of paint are applied here. There I am. There I am with Leonard. Leonard has this thumbs up gesture, right? And I'm just imitating it. He does that in most, if you look online, almost every picture of Leonard. So one of the great things is psychological. Leonard was a marginal guy. He was told by the world that he didn't amount to much. But once he got this project, he's a happy guy every day. He can't wait to get up and start painting, start building his mountain. Okay, and I think I'll get to at the end. I'll say that I think that's important. Okay, that's it. That's it for the quick survey of big name outsider artists, if that's not in itself an oxymoron. Now it's home movies and show and tell time. A brief interval, but vital to my attempt at coherence here. What follows is a quick tour via family photos, I apologize in advance to my family, of various American and one international outsider art site in more or less chronological order. This is the only one I'm worried about because it's got Suzanne in it. She doesn't like pictures. But this is our family at the Garden of Eden in Lucas, Kansas. The home and yard of Samuel Dinsmore. Like Joe Minter down in Birmingham, Dinsmore had a political agenda, materialized as concrete statues narrating the history of the world as he saw it. Socialist themes mixed with biblical figures and Masonic imagery. Dinsmore, the earliest born in 1843 of the figures we're looking at today, is entombed on the property with his first wife. Not buried, that's important. Visitors can peer at him through his windowed coffin. Our family visited Suzanne, Maisie, Taylor, and Jesse, in that order, right to left, sometime in the middle 1990s. I don't remember the exact year. Now, there is another garden, also labeled as a garden. This is Paradise Gardens, the work of Howard Finster. Remember I told you that they were unable to afford, because we didn't have a spare 80 grand lying around, they were unable to afford a Darger for me. But they did buy me a Finster. They bought me a Howard Finster, which I cherish. And it's displayed in our home. Finster is also very well known. He was born in 1916 and died in 2001. He's best known for paintings absolutely covered with writing. It's like one genre is there, one sort of medium is not enough for this guy. He has to do a painting and then he has to cover it with writing. Let's see, where am I here? I've lost sight. Oh yeah, here we go. Born in Alabama, lived most of his life in Georgia's northwest corner. Suzanne and I visited after watching one of Taylor's basketball games. So it was, my family's been very, very good to me in sort of being tolerant of this obsession. Okay, one more of these. You remember this guy from our earlier treatment? This is Henry Darger's grave. And Jesse and I visited it and took this picture when we were in Chicago to see a Cubs game. We're big Cub fans. By the way, it's a mark of my devotion to Linda's projects that the Cubs are playing right now. And I am not watching it. I am running my mouth here in this series. So, but this, I loved it that the people who opened Darger's apartment, this is a potter's field. He's buried in a poor man's grave. This was purchased by his landlords after they discovered his treasure trove of paintings. And it's their idea to write protector of children beneath it. It's a wonderful story. Okay, a couple more of these. We're going real fast through these. I don't know why I'm pushing the wrong button. There we go. Some of you will recognize this. Any of you ever drive through Amarillo, Texas on Interstate 40? This is Cadillac Ranch, right? And we don't need to talk too much about it. You can see Taylor's a good bit taller than he was back at the Garden of Eden. So that's Maisie and Taylor at Cadillac Ranch. This is a collective thing. This was put up, even though it's in Amarillo, it was put up by the Ant Farm, a San Francisco architectural and art collective. Okay, and we're going to see a few more collectives. We're going to the last ones. This is the most recent one. This was taken in January. Taylor and I, he was moving to LA and I was helping him drive his car out there. And we went to Watts Tower. I don't know if any of you know Watts Towers. It's in, some of you do. It's in LA. It's the work of a single man, 13 or 14 towers, built by Sabato Rodia, born in 1879, just a little later than Dinsmore, in Italy. Rodia lived at the site and erected a total of 17 decorated rebar and cement structures between 1929 and 1954. This is an example of one that has been very securely renovated. It is now a California State Historical Park, and they charge admission, and there's a fence around it, and it's not just falling apart. So it would be an example of a really successful restoration. Okay. And now we have our only international one. This will maybe less well known, but in the summer of 2015, Jesse and Taylor and I did a Baltic States tour, and they were wonderful. They loaded up their fancy iPods with the kind of music I like, Springsteen and Dylan and Aretha and all that, and put up with hours of listening to Dad's music. But Dad was driving because our rental car was a stick, and I was the only person who could drive it. Okay, but from the beginning, our turnaround spot was a site in Lithuania known as the Hill of Crosses that for years had been on my bucket list. I wanted to see it, and it really made it a pleasure that they accompanied me. Here's the story. Its roots go back to the 19th century, when locals placed memorial crosses on the site of a former hill fortress to commemorate men who died fighting Russian overlords. This practice intensified during the 1960s and 70s. Soviet authorities bulldozed the site on at least 3 occasions, but it always returned. People just kept showing up and placing crosses there. It's basically become a nationalist and religious pilgrimage site as a kind of central icon of being Lithuanian. But it now gets international visitors. When we visited, we could see visitors arriving in busloads. And there's a gift shop where you can buy little crosses and then go out and tour the site and then choose a place to leave your own cross. The latest estimates I've seen is that there are There are more than 100,000 crosses there. So we're going to step back. These are just close-ups so I get the boys in. But if you move back, there's a more distance. It's an absolutely stunning site. It was our turnaround point. And this is one that, you know, it's a work of art, clearly, but collective understates the case here, doesn't it? I mean, it's not a small collective, and it's a voluntary one. Here's the sort of general entrance to the place. And I find this just absolutely mind-boggling, you know. And the boys, for all their blaseness, you know, they're professionally blasé at their age. But you could even I could tell, I was really pleased with this. You could tell that they were impressed by this. Okay? So that's the end of that little segment, the family tour, right? Just to demonstrate some of the breadth of what we're doing. Okay? So, all this, the well-known artists, combined with the family photo album, should demonstrate our family's sustained engagement with outsider art. But I ran into a problem. I exposed an obvious mistake in my own thinking when, in response to Linda's invitation and Suzanne's prompting, I started organizing this talk. Remember, back at the beginning of today, I cited this 2002 introduction for Doris Curtis's book as my introduction to outsider artists. But that doesn't work because it's disproven by the very first photo, the one I showed you from the family album, this one. That's from the mid-90s. Doris Curtis is still 8 years in the future, and our family's already going around looking at outsider art things. So I didn't know what to do with this. The discrepancy puzzled me. I'd always told myself I started out in outsider art with Doris Curtis. And then I got another break. I just caught a break. So I've come to see Linda's invitation, Suzanne's suggestion, and now my sister Emily gave me a break. I meet her every 6 weeks or so, every 2 months for bagels at Einstein Bagels. And we sort of talk about whatever is going on in our lives. And on one of these trips, she brought along an old snapshot album owned by our mother. And paging through it, I came upon a 1939 photograph labeled Uncle Newton in our mother's handwriting. And in a flash, a very old memory returned. Here's Uncle Newton, 1939. Uncle Newton, and this is the memory, Uncle Newton was the ship guy, an outsider artist if there ever was one. And my encounter with him preceded Doris Curtis by more than half a century. Here's that story as briefly as I can tell it. My single meeting with Uncle Newton, my great uncle actually, occurred in 1948 or 1949 when I was 5 or 6. Our family lived then in North Dakota, parents and 3 children, me the oldest and the only boy. But we made summer vacation trips back to West Virginia, where both of my parents lived, their grandparents lived. My guess, this is the actual research I did on this talk. I spent most of my time actually trying to run this story down. My guess is that we drove down from my mother's parents' home in Elkview, near Charleston, to visit White Sulphur Springs on the Virginia border, where Uncle Newton lived and where he died in 1950. On the way, and this I remember vividly, I was repeatedly and sternly cautioned by both mother and father. Uncle Newton had been badly wounded in the First World War, they said. He was very nervous, that was the word they used, almost a hermit, unable to have a job, cared for by relatives. He was, they stressed, especially sensitive to sudden movement and loud noise. I, of course, excelled in both of these. A hyperactive loudmouth, constantly in trouble with adults. Father and mother had reason for concern. But then we arrived. Inside, hugged by welcoming adults, my whole attention was instantly captured by a large replica of a magnificent sailing ship, brightly painted, equipped with mast and sails, mounted on a bureau or sideboard at just above eye level. I was transfixed. Later, my recollections more than 60 years later are fragments. There was another ship in another room, some sort of workshop, this one unpainted, lacking rigging. That's about it for actual memories of the visit. though I have much clearer recollections of the praise lavished upon me during the return trip and in the accounts given to grandparents upon our arrival back. Apparently Brad, I was Brad then, had been a very well-behaved boy. And Uncle Newton had been so taken with my admiration for his work that he invited me to tour his workshop. I don't really remember that. Sit at his workbench, handle the tools. Everyone was pleasantly surprised. But most vivid of all, and this was for me the takeaway, the thing that has stuck with me, was the contrast between the pre-visit narrative, where Uncle Newton was presented as a pitiable figure, a grown man so injured in body and mind as to require a child's care, juxtaposed to the jaw-dropping trip, the ship, this beautiful ship. I didn't have the language yet to articulate my praise. I would now identify the finished ship as the first work of art that awed me. But I've gone forever after as a man skeptical of others' dismissals. I'll wait, I think, to see what she or he can do. By the time I was in high school, our home in Indiana by now displayed a ship Uncle Newton made for my mother, his niece, the HMS Ruth, he called it. My nephew, Ryan Wilson, my sister Allison's son, owns it now. I've looked a little, not a lot, and it may be that Uncle Newton's last unsunken ship is in Ryan Wilson's home. And I wrote to him, and here it is. Okay, so that's not the very ship that I saw, but it's very much like it, very much like it. And so my encounter with my sister is what sort of unraveled the discrepancy of, my erroneous location of the beginning of my interest in outsider art with Doris Curtis. It actually began a long time earlier, but I had sort of forgotten that memory. Okay, so I want to move toward my close with one last good piece of good fortune. I'll move to my close now, citing an earlier stroke of luck, not earlier than the meeting with Uncle Newton, but earlier than the suggestion for this talk. It's an occupational lucky break, which has given a great boost to my recent work. Back in 2013, Fulbright Dean Bill Schwab, together with his wife Judy, who then supervised the David and Barbara Pryor Center for Arkansas Oral and Visual History, she did it from her post in the Chancellor's office, came up with a plan to link the Center for Arkansas and Regional Studies, which I direct, to the Pryor Center. And for me, this was a huge boon, giving me closer workplace ties with Randy and Scott and Sarah and Susan, the people that work down at the Pryor Center. Their interests tie beautifully in with my own, and their technical skills leave mine in the dust. So the first thing we did together, and I'm moving to my final thing here, is we plotted a shared publishing venture with the UA Press, a series called The Arkansas Character. Our first volume celebrated the work of a great outsider artist from Arkansas. So we're coming back home now for the last part of this talk. It was titled True Faith, True Light, The Devotional Art of Ed Stilley. It was published in 2015. Show and tell, there it is, okay? It's a lovely book, beautifully produced by Mike Beaker, David Scott Cunningham, Liz Lester, Melissa King, Charlie Shields, and their colleagues at the press. The primary stars of this story, however, sharing the stage with Stilley himself, are Kelly and Donna Mulholland. It was they, Donna first, though she immediately rushed to tell Kelly, who stood like Nathan Lerner at Darger's door. See, here's the connect, there's that, that's why that slide of the apartment and the garage are so critical. Somebody has to see it. And that somebody has to be inspired by it. That somebody has to be motivated to do something. And you won't believe what Kelly was motivated to do. Kelly was motivated to spend roughly 25 years collecting as many of Ed Stilley's instruments as he could, repairing them, preparing, encouraging a friend of his to publish the first feature article in a newspaper. His friend was Flip Putoff, did a newspaper piece in 1997 about Stilley. He put together an exhibit at the Walton Arts Center, 2013, I think. And I was told to go to that exhibit by Russell Cothran. So all these things have to come together. And he wrote this book. So Kelly wrote this book. He got another friend of his, Kirk Lanier, to take beautiful pictures. And then all of a sudden, I got to come into it like I did with Doris Curtis. He was a better writer. I didn't have to do anything. But I did write an introduction for it. And so by this prior experience of mine, I was able to say, I knew when I walked into the Walton Arts Center and saw all those Ed Stilley guitars, I was already very much generically at home. I said, yeah, it's another outsider artist, and a really good one. So that's the, let's have a look now. I've talked without giving you these. There's Ed with the cover of the book and one of his creations. There's one of Flip Puthoff's black and white photographs of Ed at his Hogskull Hollow home, playing what became one of the more famous guitars. And there's Kelly and Donna, as Still on the Hill, using Ed Stilley instruments in concert. So here's an example. I can't tell you what the community is when James Hampton's work is discovered, beyond the first guy, beyond the landlord showing up and not just having it carted away as junk. Because I don't live there. I don't know what happened. But here, I know the community that did it, and I know, and I haven't named them all. There's a local chiropractor who took X-ray photographs. In other words, there's a whole cohort of people who document and preserve and publish the work of Ed Stilley. And he is now a known outsider artist. By the way, this is a tiny bit of Professor Arcana. The term folk artist gets thrown around a lot. He's not a folk artist. It's fine if people out in the newspaper world call him a folk artist. But for anything to be folk, it has to be a tradition. So what I would look for the day I walked in there, said, did somebody teach Ed to do this? Ed teach somebody else to do it after Ed's gone? Was there a pre-existing tradition of Ozark stringed instrument making that Ed was a part of? Answered all those questions is no. Ed's a one-off, like Hampton, like Darger, okay? So that's end of excursus. He's an outsider artist. And these terms really don't have any precision, but when you can get a little precision, it's sort of a nice thing to do, okay? So the story, the story of Ed's move from Hogskull Hollow to the University of Arkansas Press is very strictly analogous to the story. They have the same narrative arc as to the story of the movement of James Hampton from the garage to the Smithsonian. It's just down the street, but it's a long, long way. Okay. Now we go to, let me see, I think that's it for these pictures. Yeah. Now we're going to the current project, and here's the new show and tell. This is the only copy of this now in existence. It was loaned to me by Mike Beaker back there, who was sitting on his table at the University of Arkansas Press. This book will be out next month. That's still true, Mike?
Yep. Okay.
It's called An Arkansas Florilegium, and I'll tell you the story of it now. It's our last real example, okay? It's called an Arkansas Florilegium. It's a fancy word, and I'm responsible for it, so I'll explain it to you. Okay, yeah, it means Book of Flowers. Okay, so Stilley was Volume 1 in our Center for Arkansas and Regional Studies Prior Center collaboration. Number 2 will be out next month. A splendid coffee table reissue of a pioneering and now newly illustrated Arkansas Botanical Atlas. It's called An Arkansas Florilegium. The initial atlas was published in 1978, the work of a University of Arkansas faculty member, Edwin B. Smith, who produced, as it was then titled, an atlas and annotated list of the vascular plants of Arkansas, basically a taxonomic study of Arkansas flora. But it wasn't illustrated. He didn't have the money. It's on mimeograph paper. Very well bound, but on mimeograph paper. The University of Arkansas Press didn't exist yet this time. So there's Ed Smith. The illustrations that now grace this reissued, about to be published volume are the work of this man, Kent Bonner, who's about to be better known because of this book, sort of like Ed and Kelly's work. He's a wonderful artist and largely self-taught. He doesn't have a BA, but he's as good a ecological botanist as you're going to find in this part of the country. There's the cover of the book, and there's Kent Bonner. It's an absolutely wonderful story. Here's what happened. As soon as Smith published his book, Bonner got a hold of it. And Bonner started lugging it around. As heavy as it was, he treated it as if it were a kind of field guide. And he lugged it around in the woods, mostly in Newton County, but he rumbled all over. He worked for the Park Service for a while, and so he was stationed as far south as Mena at Wilhelmina State Park. And so he traveled around the state, but he was centered in Newton County. And he would enter directly into the margins of the book drawings of the plant described on that page. You got that? So when I got a hold of it, it had thousands and thousands of drawings in it. And he'd been doing it for about 30 years. He started doing it, say 1980 as the time. In this instance, the man at the garage door, responsible for initiating the preservation and publication of Smith and Bonner's labors, was Trey Marley, sitting right back there running the camera today. He cajoled Bonner into permitting the kidnapping of his manuscript, and then assembled a cohort of fellow admirers to shepherd it into the world. Here it is. We had our first meeting at the Fayetteville Public Library. The room was reserved by Marley. And there I'll go back to get some of those drawings so you can look at it. But there is the informal cohort charged by Marley with getting this book published. And the center is Bonner himself holding the copy. You can see, it's got duct tape on it. It's completely beat up. He dropped it in a stream one time even. So Marley and other people over in Newton County were worried that, it would get lost. And he'd been doing this for 30 years, and it was the only copy, right? So the other figures in it, it's really an amazing cohort, and I really love this picture. Marley is pictured just to the left of Bonner in the picture. But the guy behind him there is my brother, Steve. And this is where you just get lucky. Your family history plugs in again. My brother, Steve, lives in Indiana, and he made his living running a book conservation business. He's a book conservator, okay? So I called him and told him this story that I'm telling you, and asked if he'd be willing to unbind the book so that we could scan it, so that Joshua Youngblood over in Special Collections at the library could scan it to take down to Mike Beaker at the University of Arkansas Press and get it published, right? And meanwhile, I would learn something about botany and write an introduction. And so that's why I'm in the picture. The guy to the right, the most interesting figure in the thing, is a Buddhist monk my own name I had for him at the time was Yeshe. And one of the problems when I got done writing the introduction, I said, come on, I need another name for Yeshe. I can't just put his name in there as Yeshe. But I couldn't, and I got it, but I couldn't get it directly for him because just after he attended this meeting, he went into a 3-year vow of silence in his hermitage out in Newton County. So it's just, I live for this kind of thing. When I got called by Marley and told about this and said, would you be a part of this project? I said, oh yes, so, I couldn't buy this kind of good time, okay? And a couple years later, I know a lot more. I'm not a botanist, but I know a lot more about botany than I did 2.5 years ago. And I especially know a lot more about botanical illustration, and the history of that. I didn't even know it, but there's a wonderful book called A History of Botanical Illustration. So many, many years ago, I was encouraged by my friend Henry Glassy when I was hesitant to undertake a project because I didn't know anything about it. He said, read 30 books and you'll be an expert. And I've taken that as a kind of motto for the rest of my life, and that plugs into Linda's, notion about, failing to specialize decently. You just read 30 books, and you're good to go. Okay, now let me go back just so you can see some of these drawings. The thing on the left is the front page. It's the title page of the original atlas with Bonner's drawings in it. And then just page after page. I don't know how many drawings there are in here, but what I did was count 20 pages. I counted the drawings on 20 pages and then just extrapolated through the 580 pages of the book. And my guess is there's somewhere between 4,500 and 6,000 drawings in this single volume, which has now been preserved. The original is in special collections. Bonner donated it. And the press is publishing it in hardcovers. It'll be the most beautiful coffee table book I've been associated with. The reason I wanted to do this is the before picture, right? You see the manuscript, you see the sort of people who stood at the apartment door or the garage door. And then this is the end product. And remember I told you what a hard time she gave me? Called me a whippersnapper? Well, this is Doris Curtis at the end of the day when she had her fancy book and she was seeing it for the first time.
Yeah.
I got a hold of the analog of this from the villain of the piece, Larry Malley, and drove to Conway with it to show it to Doris Curtis. And there she is, seeing it. She's a happy camper. And the whippersnapper has been forgiven. Okay? So, and here's Kelly's book. I didn't take this picture. I wasn't present for this, but Kelly sent me the picture. There's Ed Stilley at the same moment. Ed, the day he got his book. And did you take that picture, Kelly? Yeah. So this is a great gig to be in because, I'm an English professor, right? I mean, I wrote a book about Samuel Beckett. I've written articles about Wallace Stevens and Norman Mailer. And a lot of these people were alive when I wrote about them. But did I get any thanks for it? No. They didn't even acknowledge that I had written about them. But when I have my folklore hat on and I do this kind of work, you get this. So you get to have a good time, you collect a regular paycheck, and people thank you. It's a wonderful job. Okay, I'm going to close now just with I have one more slide because this is an academic lecture by an honors college. So you have to have conclusions. You have to have conclusions, right? Maybe I should tell you this. I didn't plan. I didn't write it down. When I wrote my PhD dissertation at the University of Toronto, I had a big white page at the end of the thing, 300 pages long. End of the thing, there's a page that says conclusions. Turn the page, blank page. Turn one more page, bibliography. Okay, no conclusions. And I got away with it. They gave me a PhD. All right, but I'm more cooperative now and less of a wise ass. So I have some conclusions. Mine could not be more extravagant. In the first place, conceding that the very term outsider art is at several levels arbitrary, I'd suggest more positively that great art is great art wherever found. That regardless of received opinion, each of us recognizes it alone. And that furthermore, a visceral component, finally inaccessible to accounting, contributes to that recognition. I'd suggest also that great art characteristically bears the indelible signature of its maker, and no less characteristically takes the form of a finely idiosyncratic address to the world at large. The model for this suggestion comes from Russian poet Vladimir Mayakovsky's so-called suicide poem. Some of you may know it. One translation has it say, "At such a time you rise and find you speak to all the years, the future, and the world." We are trained in our culture to value technical mastery in whatever medium above most features, and so are resistant to the idea of responding with unreserved admiration to works we perceive as unpolished or clumsy. There's nothing wrong with this, but my experiences in outsider art have made me suspect that this training, in so directing our attention, may occlude our appreciation of other features, of audacious originality, of conception, for example, or daring generic hybridization. I have learned to delight in outrageous comparisons of the works I've mentioned today with what seem to me canonical analogs. And I've found that for me at least, such comparisons serve to illuminate both poles. James Hampton's Throne is a full-bore theodicy, at the same time materializing his vision of a coherent cosmic order and securing his role in it. I'm reminded, of course, of Dante's move in the fourth canto of Inferno, where Homer and Virgil invite him to join their illustrious club. I made a sixth among such store of wisdom, says Pinsky's translation. Taking in the varied tableaus in Joe Minter's yard, I read them as grim updates of Winthrop's old dream for the new world, that we would make of our opportunities a city upon a hill. Long way still to climb. In such a light, I understand Henry Darger's illustrations of his 15,000-page epic as analogous to Blake's images of Milton's Paradise Lost. When I recall my first glimpse of 25 to 30 of Ed Stilley's guitars, beautifully mounted on the Walton Art Center wall, I never fail to imagine how a fleet of Uncle Newton's ships might have awed given a similar showing. But then I'm always comforted. It doesn't matter at bottom. Henry Darger lived intensely as General Darger, and James Hampton lived as St. James. Even if Meyer Wertlieb and Nathan Lerner had carried their work to the dump, their lives would have been lived the same way. So it's wonderful that these works get saved, but for me the most important thing is the experience of the artist, who protects herself or himself by focusing upon this work. Ed Stilley today would still be God's obedient and faithful servant, even if Kelly had devoted 25 years to another cause. There's no stopping me when I get on this kind of roll in these moods. Tressa Prisby's Bottle Village, Leonard Knight's Salvation Mountain, Kent Bonner's impossibly detailed drawings of tree trunks. Confronted with any and all of these shining achievements, I am once more entranced. Captured by art's finally mysterious allure, I'm back in West Virginia at Uncle Newton's, once again that stilled and quieted child. If I've conveyed some portion of his rapture here, my purposes will have been realized. Thank you.